First of all, just some setup for the round, and then we're just going to mechanize why we think on balance is the best thing to do. Carl strategy here is I am not an econ expert, and we're going to do this as the average intelligent voter, I think, would assess the round. Hope the judges do the same. A couple things on normativity. We think on balance this is not about like what we think is best for the individual founders or people that take over. It's probably overall market trends, i.e. when we set this norm that it is on our side very normal to replace them, on their side it looks very normal to keep them, and it's weird to do the opposite on either side of the house. I think importantly it's just about overall market stability. We don't get like rapid speculation, companies going under, investors pulling out. We also think it's very important we're going to impact why this impacts the people that actually work at these companies, and it's not just about the CEOs but all the people they manage. I think a couple things on what the norms are actually going to manifest in and why we think it's better based on the incentives of two different actors in this case. Number one, I think when we look at which one is perceived to be the aberration, which one looks like something is wrong and something is being abnormal, on our side of the house we think it's far better that when you switch out when a company goes public to someone that is brought in, so usually it looks like shareholders vote in someone new who wasn't previously part of the company to the CEO role. We think this is going to happen on balance most of the time on our side, most of the time not on their side, and we're still going to explain even when it probably shouldn't happen, i.e. the social norm pressures the company into doing it on our side. The harm is way better to bite on our side than biting the harm of the opposition bench. A couple things with the incentives of founders, 3 points here. Number one, I think founders' expertise are not necessarily trained to what is necessary to run a public company. Number one, companies that tend to go public are doing so because they need access to capital that they can't access when they're privately owned. The reason for this is, number one, it's because you want to expand, you want to either like keep your company afloat, and because going public obviously means you cede a lot of control of your company, it means a couple things must have happened. Number one, it means you need the money. Number two, it means you cannot access it by staying private. Therefore, it must absolutely be a necessary step to keep your company going. I think this sets the stakes for this debate insofar as it means that something must be it must be a very important choice to have gone public, and we're going to explain why in those circumstances, in that specific context, it is unlikely that a founder is the best one to guide the ship for these reasons. Number one, their expertise is likely to be mismatched to the kind of expertise needed to guide a company that is either going through an expansion because they've gone public or just trying to keep the ship afloat because they need that extra capital. Their expertise is likely managing a small team with a revolutionary idea. They're likely to be good at being market disruptors, maybe selling themselves to like a small number of investors to get their firm going. I think they're likely to maybe be like good people managers in terms of they've got a couple loyal friends that they built this company like, you know, like the Google stereotype, like from their garage and building it from the ground up. Those kinds of skills, though important to an early company, don't necessarily translate to managing a company that is large enough to go public. There's obviously tends to be just a general size that is necessary before anyone is even willing to buy stocks in your company. So I think when it looks like the expertise they have, it is unlikely to be things like recognizing the importance of like good financial management. You can have great ideas but not know what the fuck like a balance sheet looks like. You can be an individual who is very good at being able to understand market incentives in terms of like, I think this product will be popular, but not necessarily whether or not this like company has in the financial position to actually keep like that product going. So then you have problems where individuals who set up these companies are emotionally tied to the company and to the products they produce, but not necessarily financially tied in the same very cold calculus way that might be necessary. So on our side, when we bring in someone new, they're probably going to like maybe rebrand the company, get rid of that logo that the original founder made themselves and is emotionally attached to, or fire someone that the founder was best friends with, that they set up the company with, but is a bit inept at their job, and they need to clean house as a way to revitalize the company. Those kinds of choices are more likely to be made by individuals with zero emotional attachment who were voted in by the shareholders just to make a lot of money, and I think that is likely to be choices that keep the company alive. These stakes are important here because when you keep that company afloat or continue to expand it, it means the people that work for you don't go unemployed, and the people that invested in you don't lose their money. On the balance of probabilities, I think when you look at individuals that founded a company, they are less likely just from the fact that what they were good at was setting up a company doesn't mean they are good at keeping it going when it is now a publicly accountable, large organization that may need to make massive structural changes to either maintain profitability or increase profitability. I think the legacy problem where they become obsessed essentially with like the things they are emotionally attached to the people they built the company with, or even just to the fact they feel entitled to run the company. I don't have to care what the shareholders think because I built this company from the ground up. When you have an individual who's hired and could be very easily fired by the shareholders, they are less likely to make essentially those arrogant choices. The reason this is so significant is that, panel, when you have a company that is likely to be doing things like, for example, going public, as I already explained, it means they are likely stagnant or under threat from going under. Or number two, they actually need like some broader structural changes, i.e. they are no longer adapting to changing markets. It's like look at like companies, even the best run companies can still suffer that, like BlackBerry, like really botched a many-year lead over Apple in the cell phone market. The reason we think it's better that the norm is that we push these people out, that it looks normal to have someone removed, is because, again, balance of probabilities, I think someone who is hired by the shareholders to run the company as CEO or CFO is likely to just have higher qualifications on balance than someone who just was good at running the company but didn't have to prove themselves to anyone, i.e. they set it up, they ran it, they didn't have to go through a job hiring process. On our side, the new person always has to be hired, always has to have some level of qualification. So just the odds that we pick someone on our side that is shit is relatively low. The odds that you are stuck with someone because of the social norm, you don't want to be looking like you're ditching your founder, which on their side will look like something is wrong. Like, why is the founder leaving? Is there something wrong with the company? Are they not trustworthy? Are they unstable at the top? Those kinds of things are likely to be norms that allow shitty people to stay, which has huge problems because we don't have a manager who is able to make difficult choices and runs a company into a ground that impacts everyone within it. So just the risk, the likelihood of that risk, and the scale of that risk going wrong is so much worse on the opposition side than on the gut. I'll take opening.
So just curious, if you've prepared yourself for the company to grow, why would you not educate yourself about the requisite skills to manage the company?
Even if you are the smartest finance person, if you are super loyal to your CFO because you've been working with them for 10 years and they're not very good or they're not making the necessary moves, then you're not going to fire them. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so most of the stuff you're talking about is just fixed by the IPO itself. The company becomes accountable to a board that is not the founder. They bring in probably an independent finance person, and they have new business ideas that are platform. What doesn't change is the market ideas and vision. Steve Jobs knew that Apple was going to go into personal computing, even though he didn't run the financials.
Yeah, so a couple things on this. I think, number one, I've already just explained why shareholders aren't always like the intense experts who read through like every single board report, every single meeting, but they are when they're hiring at least forced to think in that moment about who do I want to hire. On their side, just passivity on the chance of those that buy these stocks allows shitty people to remain. So again, just the bar for keeping bad people in place is a bit higher on our side. It's harder to do that. But number two, I think it's important to note that when you have that ability to depart, i.e. on our side, founders can leave, and that looks normal. It means that when those choices are the correct ones, i.e. the founder just even like recognizes I don't want to be running a massive company, I'll probably go like start a new startup or something. It allows them to do that without fucking over the old one. Because again, when we live in a world where it's very normal to leave, no one questions is something wrong at the company, the founder just didn't like jump ship. On opposition world, you also end up with a case where even if the shareholders believe that the founder isn't very good, they are scared to ditch them because that makes the market think that company's unstable and their own share value goes down. So they actually have an incentive to keep mediocre people at the top. That is a problem, we solve that.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech and give the court the needed opposition to open the case for OO.
Two observations at the start of the speech. The first is to notice that the process of transitioning from private to public ownership is an incredibly fragile point in time for a company. Why? Because markets have incredibly limited information about a company when it goes public. There are very few financials. They don't have income statements. They don't have cash flows. They don't have balance sheets of companies to look at when a company goes public. They only have information from the C-suite, etc. But also, one piece of news or one piece of information sways share price to a huge degree when you go public, much more so than any normal company that's been public for a long amount of time. The second observation is to note this, that this norm probably looks like shareholders expecting the C-suites and the founders to step down, as opposed to the other way around, for reasons I'll explain. So the first argument is that the process of ousting the C-suite has huge harms. The premise of this argument is that founders and people who are currently running this company when it goes public probably don't want to leave the company for a few reasons. One is for the reason that opening government themselves say, founders have a huge, intense emotional attachment to their own idea, their own product. And if we characterize entrepreneurs in the status quo, often entrepreneurs have had multiple ideas that often failed. And their one idea that got to an IPO, that got to the stage where it was public, is probably their most valuable possession. The one thing in their life that they're most proud of. This company is probably something that they attach their entire life worth to. And so there's a huge, incredible emotional attachment. And despite this norm, they're incredibly unlikely to want to step down. But second, no thank you. these founders probably lose all of their equity in the instance in which they're ousted because they have to step down from being part of this company. And often, their equity is a significant portion of their net worth. Their equity is like probably what's keeping them alive currently by selling small amounts of the money they own in this company in order to stay alive. So this is a huge portion of that net worth. But thirdly, and most importantly, just the personal relationships that you have with your employees in this company. If you've created a startup, it's hours and hours every day, often without rest, often without being able to sleep at night because you're wondering whether you're going to get that offer the next day. The personal relationships that you built from day one with all the employees that you have around you are incredibly important to you as a founder. So for those reasons, founders and current management are probably very unlikely to want to step down even if this norm exists in the status quo. What are the harms of this argument? First, many employees, especially ones who have deep emotional connections with the founder and current management, are also likely to leave in the event of, for example, the management changing. Why is that so problematic? Because it's not just that you get career executives coming into the company, changing the vision, etc., but you also have to replace the coders, all the people who are there from the ground up, doing all of the other tasks, who know how the company works from the ground up. And these are people that are much harder to replace than just implementing career executives in order to help you. But second, just in terms of the optics and image of this company, when so many of your employees are leaving, it probably looks incredibly bad on you as a company if so many employees are leaving because the founder has been ousted by BlackRock or Vanguard who have taken over this company privately and is ousting the current management. So for those reasons, the process of ousting the C-suite is probably going to likely to lead to huge harms. The second argument is that the career executives that opening government want to put in instead probably aren't the ideal managers that they like to think they are. The first mechanism under this argument is that often career executives are puppets of capitalism. Often, they're appointed by people who work in BlackRock or Vanguard. And when shareholders go to the table, the person that they're trying to appoint are basically just the puppets of these companies because they know that this chief officer is going to do everything that BlackRock or Vanguard tell them to do. And so often, these high C-suite career executives aren't people who care about the company. As OG themselves say, they have zero emotional attachment to the new company. That is so problematic. I don't know why you'd say that as a government team. If you have zero emotional attachment to your company, then obviously they have no incentive to the growth of the company. Rather, what is the incentive of a career executive when they come into a new company? Their incentive is to make themselves look so good that when they get their next job at the next company that goes public and the next chief officer position they have the best route to getting there. What does that mean? Any point in time, a company looks like it might be doing bad financially, or a company has a negative piece of news, the chief officer who has no emotional attachment to this company is going to drop ship. They're going to leave. They're going to try and find that new job. They have zero emotional attachment, as opening government themselves say. So when companies undoubtedly have bad financial report one quarter, or one piece of news goes out, or there's a lawsuit against them, career executives are going to be the ones who are going to stick through and thin. But often it is the founders who have that emotional attachment, as governments say, who are going to stick around in the long run. The second, I'll take opening government.
You don't lose your equity when you sell your company.
Okay, but you yourself say that you have incredible emotional attachment to this company, and if you can no longer run it, your own idea, your literal baby, then obviously you're still not going to want to leave, even if you don't lose your money. The third thing I want to do in this speech is respond to the idea that founders are stupid and they don't understand management. I just want to note a few things. First, you can presumably hire people. Obviously, maybe the CEO is the founder, but not everyone is the founder. So obviously, you can just hire someone who knows how to read an income statement or a balance sheet. I've heard that high schoolers nowadays can do that as well. So it's probably very unlikely that these founders don't know how to do basic financials, etc. It's probably not something that's going to be very difficult for these individuals. Second, as Matt says, if you know that you're going public, if you know there's going to be a board of shareholders, if you know that BlackRock owns 30% of your company and is trying to put in this new chief executive officer and is trying to basically replace you, then you're going to be as stringent as possible at knowing what you're talking about, at knowing how your company is going to grow, at keeping your company, at trying to keep your company to yourself and not letting your baby go to a career executive who's just going to ruin that opportunity in the future. But thirdly, I just want to talk about innovation and new ideas. Often, career executives, they might have got an MBA at some fancy business school. They might have done, for example, worked at fan companies, etc. But often, they're not the ones coming up with the ideas that made these companies successful in the first place. often they're the ones who are trying to get sold out and bought out by the industry leaders, by industry competitors, because necessarily, if you, for example, are a career executive, and for example, Netflix offers to buy out your tech company, then obviously you're going to take the Netflix offer, because maybe now you're going to get a board on Netflix, you're going to get a position on Netflix management, or you're going to get a position at Facebook, or a position at Amazon. So often these people who have no emotional attachment are more susceptible to being bought out by industry leaders, by competitors in the market, because they want those higher order jobs and better management, as opposed to sticking with the company they have no emotional attachment to. For those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
Beginning in 3, 2. Oh, no verbal PYs if possible, just hands for that. Thank you. Okay. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. If some team in this round wants to run some kind of like socialist, anti-capitalist principle, they're welcome to do so. I think they're gonna have a very hard time in a round about like literal like which type of IPO you have. Also at a tournament where like half the people are gonna sell out and join investment banks, but like that's totally their call if that's what they want to do. But let's start quickly with what actually this debate is about. The first thing I want to frame, and I think this is important for this debate, is that this is a forward-facing debate that is going to change the norms on things. So when they tell you all these things about how you're likely to not have a good, like, you're not going to be prepared, all those types of things are likely to change insofar as this is the new norm. You're probably going to look for the people who will replace you and make sure that they align with your vision. So this whole idea of like, you're going to fundamentally lose the founder's vision, I think that's unlikely. Obviously, once they go public, that person can still be replaced, but insofar as they have all the incentives they tell you to like care about their vision, they'll probably pick someone who's better at doing the jobs that need to be done, but also one thing. But let's just also make very clear, I like flagged it in POI, let's be very clear what happens when you think. You don't lose your share of the company, which probably means that you still have a good chunk of the thing, which means you probably still have some influence on the board. You just literally don't run the day-to-day thing. So also if your company is like going completely against things, you might have, like insofar as you're probably still a large shareholder within this company, or you got bought out if you prefer that, you probably still have some degree of influence. But even if you don't, I just think the alternative on their side is far worse. You know what's the only thing that tanks a company more is when news breaks that there's infighting between the board and the founder or the new person that they put in. So this applies to CEOs POI when they tell you they're going to put in new people who are going to operate within this company and like all the like basically their POI is like this solves all your problems. Well, no, because if you're replacing the people that already exist, those are the types of things that tank a company's stock. When there's infighting with a thing, when people hear that there's a disagreement with the founder, all those things do not happen nearly on our side. And I think this is important framing off the top because this is a uniquely fragile time. This is somewhere we actually do agree with OO, insofar as those first couple quarters are probably where you need to prove solvency, you need to prove proof of concept, all these types of things. What that means is that marginal differences between returns of investments and things like that really, really matter. I don't care how brilliant or how many like online classes someone has taken, they one, will not be able to put in the 100-hour plus work week because quite literally they'll probably be doing press and other things that are disconnected from their literal job as like the chief financial officer or the CEO. But even if that's not true, like literally it's just a debate of margins. Someone who's probably done this his whole life. But let's be very clear with the incentives of these CEOs because I think this is a super uncharitable characterization. CEOs don't jump from company to company, they do, but they don't do that by just being like, hey, I was at this company and I'm good. They do it by increasing the stock price and other measurable, quantifiable things. This matters because then their incentives are perfectly aligned with the company because they care. Literally half the time a CEO's package, their payment is literally linked to how much the stock grows because they're often paid in stocks, right? Like this is literally the perfect incentives. What the difference is these incentives are marked to the growth of the company, whereas the incentives of the founder can be to clarity of vision or sticking it to the bound. I'm sorry, but like Mark Zuckerberg again is literally like bankrupting his company by pursuing Meta, which everyone with half a brain knows is a terrible idea, but he's still on board. These are the types of things when you have these visionaries who won't ever relinquish control. But importantly with this norm, they can never relinquish control, right? Not immediately, not in the long term, because as soon as they leave the company, everyone assumes that something terribly has gone wrong with the company. Versus our side, when it is the norm before the IPO that you probably prepare for that transition, and then once the transition has happened, you leave, everyone just assumes that this is status quo. There is no immediate shock. Whereas on the other side, at least some percent of companies are going to have, and we would argue a large percent, going to have that corporate battle between the new people who came in and the founders, which is far more likely. Those harms occur far more on their side and shock companies that otherwise would have been successful into failing within those particular markets. Before I carry on, I will take a POI for back half.
Yeah, so it's a norm debate on both sides. Presumably right now, there are founders who can leave without panic because there's a relative norm that although they stay, people recognize that you can build a succession plan. Like that's why Jeff Bezos gave over Amazon to Andy Jassy and the stock price went up because they viewed it as being a plausible plan.
Right, of course, like this is a norm debate, so it's a debate on which sides those happen more percentage of the time. Like, they are defending where that happened. I would say it's actually far more shocking when a person leaves their company when it's not, like that's just their burden to defend. They can explain why they think that's better, or explain why we think it's better on our side, because again, we've already given you structural reasons that they have incentives that they will better run the company with these different people who are specialized to do it. And I want to note that this isn't just like growth at 2.5% versus 7%, or not, you said that'd be a lot. Like 3% is amazing. That it matters because that is, again, literal people's jobs. If your company doesn't grow, that leads to layoff of average lead people. That leads to the collapse of the company and people being hurt on the ground, right? Like, I don't particularly care about the compensation package for CEOs, but insofar as it relates to the structural integrity of the company and the employees that work for them, I do care about those people not being laid off when the company goes under because it is less competitive. And note that all your competitors are not going to be like doing the right thing. So even if you're the visionary who suddenly like deeply cares about each and every employee, I don't think that's likely. I think if you're like a capitalist billionaire, you're probably a piece of shit. But even if that's the case, probably compared to other companies who are even more cutthroat, who are already doing this, you'll lose up to them. So therefore, those employees that you care so much about are going to lose because you aren't willing to do the other things that your cutthroat competitors. You need to hire the right people so that they do those best things. Before I carry on, I'll take a POI from front half if they have one. Nope, 2 for back half. Let's go.
Do you think that investors would have tolerated Apple spending about 5 or 6 years making no money when it pivoted from enterprise to personal computing if they didn't believe in Steve Jobs, if some like random successor was instead?
Yes, because Uber didn't make money, Netflix didn't make money, a bunch of companies that haven't made money because they were capturing like market exists. Like that is just a tool of expansion. That isn't something unique to just Apple. If they want to make their case Apple, Steve Jobs, fine. I can tell you all the other companies that failed because their founder didn't have this visionary idea. Like they're literally picking the one diamond in the mine. Like I just don't think that's a case what you can base this case off kind of thing. So what have we fundamentally given you at the end of this debate and into the front half? I think at the end, this debate isn't won by like people who like do finance mentioning more specific things. They immediately need to tell you what the structural reasons that exist are going to be better. They are going to win on some cases, we're going to win on some cases. It's who wins on a majority of cases. We tell you, at large, in most instances, the incentives that are created by replacing these people with the most possibly competent people and avoiding the strikes that the conflict that happens to them is the best thing for these companies to survive and therefore their things. On their side, they need to explain why that isn't the case in the majority of instances, insofar as that is what we broadly care about in this debate. The final thing I want to flag off, just in case this comes out of a crazy CEO or something like that, there is no like principal claim to ownership or any bullshit like that in this debate. They've chosen to take their company public. They've opted out of a lot of control. So insofar as anyone wants to talk about like the right to your intellectual property, shouldn't take it public, that was your decision to do so. Insofar as at the end of this debate, we have proven that in most instances we get the most amount of success, the best run companies, who will therefore lead to growth, which hires more employees or keeps the current employees they have. That is the biggest impact in this round. Those are the people who matter most, and that's the reason you'll vote government. Very proud to propose. Oh, sorry.
Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, and to report the Deputy Leader of Opposition to
Everyone good? I'll discuss three things. First, examining the incentives of either actor who would stand in a C-suite position. OG has three main mechanisms for why they believe that founders are likely ill-suited in these particular positions. Firstly, they say that these individuals have inadequate training. Two responses. One, as I point out in a POI, you want the company to succeed, so you've preemptively prepared yourself for the company to go public, and therefore have gotten the appropriate training in that particular position. But also, it's the case that you can do things like hire consultants and talk to those consultants about where exactly the company should be going. The DPM says you don't have time for this. Surely, number one, you have a lot of people helping you, there are groups of founders, you can delegate particular tasks. But number two, my argument proves why you do this preemptively, so the premise of that response doesn't work. But secondly, at best, there are different types of information that individuals within this debate need, i.e. information that uniquely founders have, but also information that potentially people who are more experienced with finance could have. The question then becomes, what do founders bring uniquely that they ruin on their side of the house? For their case to function, they must concede that founders are no longer in these positions and do not have a sizable role. And the reason for this is their mechanisms. Because if they are right that founders are so bad and so arrogant, they must then concede that founders no longer have a sizable influence within that particular company. So all of their responses about why you won't be ousted seem to deny the premise of the case that comes out of PM, which claim that these founders are likely going to be ill-intentioned. But DPM then says you don't lose influence. A couple of additional responses to that. One, as I point out, this narrows their margin. But number two, you are likely to be ousted because inasmuch as Rohan characterizes to you why actors who are coming in likely have different conflicting interests, and they're likely to make all the arguments that Gov makes about why founders have bad incentives, it is likely that founders no longer have influence within the company. So that is particularly harmful. Why? Because founders have unique information about the company, i.e. technical expertise where they see particular products that can go, product designs that can develop, i.e. they have specific education that they have learned, they have specific experience developing that particular product. So they have lots and lots of technical information that other people just do not have, even if they are also highly educated and also have engineering degrees. Their second mechanism is that you are likely to be nostalgic. One, as I point out, nostalgia is good. Why? Because it's not just, I want the company to remain like it was in the garage, but rather, how can I make this company better and look back fondly on my experiences initially starting the company. Number two, even if you don't buy that, there are also competing entrepreneurial attitudes which say, even if you are initially nostalgic, you have to sacrifice your babies for long-term growth, which is also an additional reason why you do appropriately educate yourself on where the company needs to go. So this is an additional response to their claims about why you lack expertise. Finally, they say that you are likely to be arrogant as a founder. One, other founders can internally check this, i.e. you are not just one individual founder, but rather it's usually a group of people who all came up with these particular designs together. So if one founder is particularly arrogant, it's likely that they will be called out and have conversations with other people. But secondly, there's a rising attitude within this sphere that arrogance can actually be bad and harmful, i.e. if you don't listen to other people, then you could make highly risky decisions that could screw over your company in the long run. So you have incentives to consult with other people, you have incentives not to be arrogant. So what then is the question in this debate? Why comparatively are the people who take over in these C-suite positions likely to be bad? One, there is a capacity issue. Because suppose you buy none of our characterization that the people who take these positions instead have bad incentives or are likely going to act in bad ways. Even if that is true, they just do not have the information that is appropriate for bringing the product in a direction that the founders believe it will be good. And I already proved why, given the founders have unique information about that particular company and a vision for that particular company, that vision is likely to be good. So even if there's an incentive to seek out this information, your capacity to get it is weakened in as much as you've ousted the founders, as I've already proven. But secondly, it's likely that in as much as you have new C-suite executives and they make all the arguments that Gov makes, the new C-suite executives get appointed on the mandate of going in a different direction that the founders were going in. So what that then means is that there is implicit pressure on the people who are hiring these new particular C-suite executives to go in a different direction. So even if they think it could be a good idea, they feel pressure to be innovative and bring the company in another way, and likely in a less risky way, which I will later prove is likely not harmful to the company. Thirdly, Rohan gives you additional unresponded to reasons about why there are also conflicts of interest here. Why are incentives the most important material in the debate? One, because it precludes every other argument. If we are able to successfully prove that founders are likely to have good incentives and unique information, whereas the people who take over on their side have bad information, every other impact in this debate is downstream of that, because these are the individuals who are controlling what exactly happens in the company and the vision that the company is going in. But secondly, as I already pointed out, there's a question of exclusivity. We can get all their benefits of talking to other people and hiring consultants. Only on our side do you get the benefits in consulting with the founders of unique information about the company. Secondly, let's talk about what direction the company goes in. I have 3 broad observations. One, confidence in the company goes down because there is a perception of internal infighting, even if that infighting doesn't actually happen. Why? Because there's likely to be media coverage. This is very, very controversial and unusual, i.e. founders get ousted from this particular company board, which means that other people perceive your company as being more risky, don't invest in it, but the premise of the IPO, as they concede, is that you want additional external capital. So your capacity to get that capital is weakened, OG.
Yeah, so a company large enough to have an IPO that matters has a proven vision. That's why people are investing in the first place. They don't want to change it. What they want to see is it grow. They want to see it grow. Literally, the goal is growth. Both sides can also have consultants to help with that growth.
So, number one, as I point out, this isn't just large companies. It's also the case that you are doing the IPO to get external capital in the first place. But number two, it's the case that other people also think my ideas are going to be better. It's not about your proven vision. It's you're ousting them because you think you have a better vision. Secondly, note that the perception argument is not contingent on whether or not founders have good incentives. Because even if it, or whether or not the new people will have good incentives, because even if it is the case that there isn't actually infighting, there's still the perception of this infighting because these people are ousted from the corporate board, so this functions independent of the incentives debate. But secondly, we flip their argument about why you lay people off internally. Why? Because inasmuch as their argument about nostalgia proves that you have a connection to the company, you are more likely to have experience interacting with people within that company, gaining feedback, understanding how customer receptiveness to different product designs and programs that that company has. But the internal culture fundamentally changes when you come in and you want to establish a new attitude and you want to establish yourself as someone who has authority within this company. So therefore, you are less likely to understand the intimate dynamics of that particular company. But thirdly, let's say that they are right and give them everything they want. I.e., it is likely the case that when you come in, you change the direction. That is awful because it means that you get rid of things like, for example, like innovations that could help you, like help address things like tropical diseases otherwise, because you have a completely different person who does not have experience in this particular field. Now, changing the entire direction of the company, changing the entire direction of where the company is going, and therefore you don't get the benefits you would have had otherwise. I'm very proud to oppose.
I think the deputy leader of opposition for that speech and can before the member of government to open the case procedure.
Problem with opening half is that opening half focuses too much on what happens to companies after they IPO. But actually, the process of IPOing already fixes a company's future to a large extent. And what actually determines whether or not a company is going to be successful and offer a product that is socially utile and offer benefits to its shareholders is probably what happens before the IPO and what is the core competencies of the company and what product is focused on by the company. And that is why we're going to bring in an extension of why the company's incentives and the founder's incentives changes to make the company better and develop a better product before the IPO. OG's impact is pretty marginal because, you know, they talk about how new executives are better at doing things, but like as Opbench already pointed out, shareholders already have control even if the founder stays on, and this doesn't really matter regardless. More important impact in this debate is what companies do before the IPO and when companies choose to IPO, crucially. Two reasons why. Firstly, most decisions about what the company's core competencies is going to be is made before the IPO. The IPO is the biggest injection of cash during a growth period of a company, and it largely fixes the company's medium-term strategic approach, right? This is why Apple, faced heaps of pressure when they had to change from enterprise to consumer, because after they IPO, people expect them to do the same thing for a long time, right? So it's not going to suddenly switch products after a company decides to IPO with a certain kind of profile. But second of all, the IPO is when the company's future is decided because there's an initial deluge of information into the public. Like Sequoia is probably writing assessments, Wall Street Journal is probably profiling you. All of this information is coming out about your company, and therefore your company's future and whether or not people perceive your company to be a successful one is already fixed at the point of the IPO. And if the IPO is not very successful and the share prices immediately crash or something, the company is basically going to be dead because there are hundreds of hawks on Wall Street trying to short you and earn heaps of money because your company died. So because of this mechanism, it is likely that whether or not your company is actually good before it's IPOing is actually what is important in this debate. How do we make the pre-IPO company better? Two things in extension. First of all, it delays the IPO so that founders realize more of their vision pre-IPO. Both OG and OO agree that the founder is pretty good at developing the product and having vision, right? If they're leading the company to the IPO, they're probably already a unicorn, they're probably really smart as a founder and have great vision because they're one of the 5% of the companies that survived the Y Combinator and they're becoming successful. This means that the founder or the founding group is probably in the best position to decide what the vision of the company is going to be and what the product is going to be in the long term. But what's happening in the status quo when the norm is the founder keeps being on the CEO after IPO is that their incentives are incredibly skewed. Founders want the IPO money to help them realize their vision rather than realizing the vision first and then seeking a higher value IPO for two reasons. First of all, the founder is probably pretty perfectionist. They don't want to half-ass their product and realize their vision with a little bit of money and then go and IPO. They probably want to seek IPO and get a lot of money and then realize their really grand vision. This means that they probably prefer to IPO really quickly so they can get the big injection of cash. But second of all, the founders probably get paid more if they hold back on realizing their vision until after the IPO, because if the founder becomes the CEO, and CEO pay is tied to growth, as both opening teams agrees. Growth is greater as a percentage share, right? If you hold back on your innovations and IPO first, and then grow your company heaps by realizing your vision. Because the founder is probably pretty arrogant and pretty confident about their product, they're likely to make the decision to do the IPO quickly and then grow the company heaps after the IPO. This is actually really, really bad because if things are still being worked out after the IPO, there is way more public scrutiny on your company. If you make a little bit of a mistake, there is likely going to be Tiger Capital or whoever is going to short your company, or the public is going to lose faith in your company if you made a little mistake. This kind of thing happens a lot after IPO, and it's way better if you already worked out your vision and mostly realized it before the IPO. On the comparative, if the founder anticipates leaving after the IPO, they will probably more likely delay the IPO, realize more of their vision more fully, maybe develop their product, maybe put their product into the market first, maybe try and turn a profit first, before going public and then signing off on the company. As a founder who is selling a lot of your shares during an IPO, a lot of your wealth and income is tied to the valuation versus later performance pay and stock options. So you want the valuation to be as high as possible so you can get as much income as possible during the IPO. Even if you hold a lot of shares still, anticipating leaving the captor's position after the IPO probably makes you want to get things done before the corporate monkeys come in, right? Rohan and Matt says that career executives are pretty bad. Founders who dropped out of Stanford with a CS degree probably also hate career executives. They probably think that the career executive is going to ruin their vision, and that's why they want to realize their vision first before the career executives take over, and that is why they will probably do more things and give more of their vision and smartness and product design knowledge before the IPO even happens. Yes, Irving?
Surely the reason you IPO is because you need the money to invest in things like R&D to realize your vision. Even if there is an incentive to do your extension, there isn't a capacity to do your extension.
No, this is just an assertion. A lot of companies IPO not because they need money to survive, but because they want more money. Anyways, closing.
Okay, this is a problem that solves itself. To the extent that for all the reasons you listed, IPOing prematurely will tank your company, CEOs and founders won't do it on either side.
Well, no, I'm not saying that all companies tank. I'm saying that some companies who otherwise could have survived are at more risk of tanking under your side, and on our side, we save those companies and realize the vision of these products and give the world a really good product. Anyway, second extension and mechanism, founders are more likely to develop succession plans that make collective decision-making more possible and checks and balance more possible pre-IPO. The problem with a lot of startups is that founders are like hiding strategic information among the immediate circle of friends of founders because they probably don't want things like competition and corporate espionage. They don't want to be replaced, and they don't want don't want to spook Peter Thiel into like causing a bank run or something. This is why they probably are not very transparent with the rest of their team when they're trying to develop their product. When there's like a core group of founders who's going to remain the core group of C-suite executives after the IPO. This core group of founders is probably like relatively bad at catching mistakes, even if the product is revolutionary and deserves to be on the market. There's a high risk that that product would fail because of some like weird strategic mistake, because the core group of founders probably like all graduated from Stanford, have similar skill sets, are friends, and are bad at catching each other's mistakes. This is really bad because there's not an allowing of like different skill sets, people with different skill sets to have an eye on the product and to like prevent these strategic mistakes from happening. But if the founders know that they will leave after IPO and they really care about the company, they probably will start developing succession plans as like CEO implied really early, and because of that, more eyes are on the product and more eyes are on the strategic decisions early, and therefore will prevent massive failures of the companies in the first place. So because we have more socially utile companies that are successful on our side, very proud to propose.
The sake of hundreds of millions of regular people around the world is dependent on the success of companies in the form of pension funds, retail like investments that people have that are the way that they're able to retire and actualize their like investment and financial goals. All of this is contingent on the capacity to be able to easily and cheaply buy public companies and profit off of their wealth, which is something that becomes nearly impossible when founders are structurally less willing to give up their company. Firstly, just some framing. I think that we will not say necessarily that founders are perfect or guaranteed to be as good as the new execs that are put in by side government, but we think that they're probably pretty damn good, to the point where the margins on this clash are probably quite small. There are probably lots of different ways to run a company that are viable. I think getting to the IPO is incredibly tough. Closing government agrees on all of this, and they're probably unicorns, and they're probably founders that have had to do a lot. And they're people that would probably have failed prior to getting to this state had they not have the willingness to be flexible and pivot, which is precisely why founders like Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos made massive pivots in their company, from, for example, being a bookstore to being Amazon as we know it today, or like Apple just being like in sort of working for companies to working in the consumer space, right? I think that once you IPO as well, there's sort of other mechanisms to solve for any problems with this gap that comes in, which I'm going to talk about later in the form of like suggesting ideas that founders have very strong financial incentives to listen to, because if better ideas are suggested and they fail to listen, they're not going to be as rich. I think even if we do worse on small margins, just the fact that this probably we should weigh a little bit towards stasis being a little bit better, just in the sense that not making massive pivots, if it doesn't make that much of a difference, means that people that have jobs at this company aren't going to be like fired and lose like hundreds of thousands of people potentially being laid off. I think this is probably better. Finally, just in terms of closing government, I think the problem solved themselves. There are very strong financial incentives for founders not to sell too early, which is essentially something they don't engage with. Their entire extension is based on founders being kind of stupid, which they can be on either side. Okay, second thing, why you get reduced IPOs and why that's a bad thing. We will essentially echo everything that opening opposition says, but give you the actual reasons why this is a bad thing, right? Just the emotional investment that founders have in their companies, the fact that opening government, as they say, are going to fire all of your friends, they're going to stop listening to your ideas to the same extent, they're going to remove the prestige that you get by being able to call yourself CEO and take away everything that you worked on for your entire life, probably your proudest achievement, and take that all away from you, right? The alternative then is that we are currently living in a time of unprecedented, private liquidity within private markets that have made highly viable alternatives to IPOs in the form of going to venture capitalists, for example, that will give very large quantities of money, which is why there are tons of huge, highly successful private companies that are not available to the public that were able to be funded. Which means, yes, maybe you don't raise quite as much money privately, but you're also like able to get to a point where your company is reasonably well funded, maybe not quite as well funded as it otherwise could be, but you have all the benefits of maintaining the control that these founders probably care about on an egotistical level, which is super important, right? So I think what you then mean is that in a world where the norm is that if you go public, you're going to be fucked, you're probably more likely not to go public, right? The way here is that even if we believe that IPOs will dramatically increase your wealth, if you're at this point where you're going to an IPO, you're probably like set, financially speaking, right? Your company's already highly valuable, the private markets will already pay you a lot, it doesn't matter as much. But also this is like a huge emotional stake, which is why probably you're gonna choose this over anything else, even if it comes at the trade-off of relative growth, which is why this makes such a big impact in this decision process. Why is this terrible? One, we say that widespread public ownership of companies and the fact that you're able to, like, regular people buy these in like, like once an IPO happens, is extremely important for people's ability to share in the wealth of companies, right? Especially given the fact that like taxation as a mechanism for redistribution has failed over and over again as companies go to like tax havens, for example. This is a mechanism that is essentially immune to that, to literally just buy shares. The effect of having fewer companies that are willing to go public is that like there's a smaller pie that people can buy into, which means the net amount of growth you can get is less, and also the amount of money that companies are willing to accept for an IPO goes up, so it becomes more expensive to invest because you need a greater incentive in order for you to be willing to make that trade-off in the first place, right? I think then the people that are getting all this wealth are those very rich private investors that are actually able to do it, while everyday people suffer and lose out on their ability to gain wealth. Take opening government.
Yeah, if your pension fund is investing in IPOs instead of the S&P 500 or other mutual funds, you need to fire your investment banker. Pensions invest in long-term stable things, not in just like a random
The way something gets on the S&P 500 is that at some point you have an IPO and then later people are able to buy it. If you don't have an IPO, then either, like, no one gets, it doesn't get to that point. I don't understand. This is kind of a ridiculous point. Becca, do you have anything?
Yeah, no, our case isn't that like they will definitely fail if they rush towards IPO. Rushing towards IPO doesn't guarantee failure. Simply realizing your vision before you go to IPO is better, because if your company wants to fail, it should fail before the IPO, and if your company is good, you should develop fully before the IPO.
This goes to my second reason why IPO, like avoiding IPOs is bad, which is that marginally, like if we care about pivoting, it is comparatively easier to pivot in the world of an IPO for a number of reasons. One, because you bring in tons of new ideas in the form of like other investors that probably have different visions for the company that are providing input to the founder. The founder has incentives to listen to. You reduce the degree of groupthink that happens when a company is owned to a small extent. This is not the same as giving them freedom. You're just hearing more ideas because you have more investors that are sort of giving that to you. But the second thing is that the marginal increase in money, which might not be enough, for example, for you to give up all of your emotional stake, could be enough for you to pivot to things that otherwise would require like a large amount of money to access. So that means that pivoting into a new space that might require the money of an IPO is now something that is comparatively more accessible. So the fact that you gain that extra degree of growth that need to give as much means companies will choose large amounts of growth, and that type of pivoting becomes more likely. The third reason why we think that increased numbers of IPOs are comparatively important is because they give a greater amount of accountability to these companies. Public companies have a substantially more, like, higher degree of scrutiny in the form of regulation that they have to follow, releasing their financials to the public. There are more investors that have personal stake in holding these companies accountable. You have activist investors that often hold them accountable to things that are good for society holistically, that have made tremendous changes within companies, for example, contributing to climate change, all of which makes these companies comparatively more likely to be accountable to individuals. Note, if you believe what OG says, that and this is kind of a separate reason, that founders having an excess degree of control is bad, then the comparative of IPOs, even when the founders stay in control, is better. Because even if the founders aren't giving up complete control, compared to a world where they don't IPO for longer, all of that time, you have all the problems that OG says. Comparatively, maybe we get some of those problems, but are mitigated at the point of the IPO, where you have all of these extra forces that are acting to keep companies reasonably accountable. So even if you believe that the top half left matters at all, which we'd say is secondary to all of the big impacts we gave you, the public access and all those other things, probably it's better on our side because you get that accountability sooner and to a much larger extent. Finally, just, excess refutation. I think that the predominant problem with opening government is probably that they put substantial stake on things that are probably going to be solved anyways. The fact that you have strong incentives to listen, that fiduciary obligations give you, even as a CEO that was once a founder, obligations to shift in large directions that are already accountable, plus all of the stuff we already told you would make them ahead of the debate. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech and give the floor to the government rep to go through the debate for the subject.
I think there has been an important piece of context in this debate that has been largely missing until Vivian's speech. What did it tell you? The world is not a place where founders are extremely careful before IPOing, and every single company that has made it to that stage is guaranteed to be a big success. Just statistically speaking, like factually speaking, 90% of startups absolutely fail, and this is after rigorous Y Combinator training and a lot of investor checkups and a lot of consulting that is done before the IPO, simply because the free market is unpredictable. If it were totally predictable, where everybody could just know how to make the big bucks, then we wouldn't have people like hiring consultants and paying them hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to figure out this extremely complex system. Our stance is very simple. In a world of extreme complexity and extreme market volatility, anything that we can do to reduce that volatility, especially when it comes to crucial socially utile innovations, is definitely a good thing. We're not saying that every single company who doesn't do their due diligence more on our side of the house is going to fail, but we think that even a slight increase in the number of companies that do fail because their founders think they can always fix things after they IPO, that is a definite harm that makes the market more volatile, that makes everyday investors and everyday individuals lose out significantly more. The structure of my speech will be pretty simple. First, on why we outweigh over our opening government. Secondly, a chat about opening opposition. And finally, on closing opposition's case on more IPOs. So first, we think OG does bring in a lot of important contributions. We agree with OG that founders maybe are not best situated to run a company after the initial public offering, and that they might cause the company to do poorly. But we think that where this debate has the biggest impact is what structurally changes the company prior to the IPO. Every single decision that is made from the founder's part, the people who are able to pull the plug and call the IPO in the first place, we think that has a much, much bigger social impact. So what is the biggest harm to innovation and investment? Investors are incredibly short-termist because the average investor is looking to make a fast turnaround for their client, or they're just the everyday person who CEO thinks is going to be able to vastly participate in the initial public offering process. They're not willing to stick it out for an incredibly long time. And what does this mean? It means that beyond leadership competence, which is variable to a degree, the success of a newly public company is heavily indexed on the product viability at the time of the initial public offering. You can always hire a consulting firm to get managerial advice, but if the product is not in tip-top shape, or the company has, or like the CEO has some kind of moral hazard because they think they can always fix things afterwards, and they can rely on things like their personality and the personal brand to continue to build the public trust just based on the perception of the CEO itself, that is when you have more moral risk on their side of the house. Viv explains why we incentivize intense caution on part of the founders before the initial public offering, why you want to make heavy profits because you want to make more money before the company is out of your control, because you probably don't have as much equity since a huge injection of cash just came in and you don't have the ability to be entitled to all of that. You're not going to be able to direct the company, so maybe you think that the company might even fail for all of the reasons that opening opposition gives you, because you hate these other financiers that come in. That is why you want to make sure that the company is already making money, that the product is already extremely viable. Sure, maybe it's still going to fail to some extent, but we think we drastically reduce risk on our side of the house. What does this mean weighing against our opening top half then? It means that the degree of economic shock is much lower on our side of the house, which means everyday people, they're not going to experience the same market volatility when they invest in a cool new stock, or just the secondary impacts of a big company going folding. That happens quite regularly on their side. And also less cold feet from investors because the perception of new companies as a whole also changes. That means you're more willing as an investor to invest in these new risky ideas when you see that on average they do a better job opening opposition.
CEO tries to weigh against us by saying that founders are marginal, but their argument is contingent on our reasons for why founders will have good incentives and have unique information.
Okay, I'll talk about that now. So what does opening opposition say? They say that ousting the C-suite has huge harms because they're incredibly emotional, that their equity is all going to be lost, which turned out to be a lie apparently, according to a POI that was pointed out earlier, and that their personal relationships are going to go away and they're going to bring their employees. Few responses to this directly. One, I think that taking away all the employees and changing the structure of the company so much that the company goes under seems very implausible. Like, people like job security, especially when you get a new huge injection of cash and you're working at like a tech startup that has some degree of succeeding, right? But even if this is true, I think it is on their side a little inequitable for like the founder from Stanford to keep only their friends, and I think it's better to open up the market so more people are able to get involved in the hiring process. If it is true that it is just a personal network, we think the less of that on their side of the house, our side of the house, the better it is. The second thing they talk about, and a large part of the case, which addresses the POI, is the incentives of career executives that, you don't want to have puppets of capitalism, that the founders want to stick around no matter what because they're emotionally attached, they think other people are incompetent. Viv tells you, and our case flips this, right? She tells you why this mentality is precisely why the founders who hold the keys to the IPO are likely to do this before they're totally ready on their side, because they're greedy for the cash now. It's not always about necessity. And they know they can realize their ingenious vision before the big bad finance bros from Harvard do take over. That means there's massive motivation to ensure the profits before IPO is huge. Your legacy is safe by taking the extreme measures needed to do every piece of last due diligence and not thinking you can just rely on your name and your profitability. The last thing that opening opposition says is that the perception of internal infighting and market instability is going to be very bad. I think this happens less when it's more of a norm as opposed to when it's really just a random thing that happens on their side of the house. CO.
Yeah, but the volatility that Closing Gov is talking about harms the people who buy IPOs on day one, who are broadly speculators, not people who we should really care about because they can hedge their losses. So I have no idea why that matters.
Well, market volatility, like the market is interconnected, right? So if there's more speculation, that still trickles down to hurt the average person. But yes, like generally speaking, average people still invest in big companies and startups because they think that, they read some article on Robinhood or whatever. Even if it's not like a huge part of the population, like first there is like contagion at large, but also some people do this. Lastly, on closing opposition, their case is also pretty simple. They say that there's going to be reduced IPOs and that because the CEO cares about their legacy, which is kind of contingent on opening opposition. But also, they also talk about how it's going to raise money and privately because they can be reasonably well funded, and having less scrutiny over public ownership is going to be very, very bad. A few responses to this. First of all, I think even if it is true that we get less IPOs, we don't think the current status of the IPO world is like really good. It's kind of terrible for investors and everyday individuals actually, especially in the startup space, because we literally have like the tweets of founders with cult of personality being able to tank the stock market and cause huge volatility with a single on a single whim. Whereas on our side of the house, you get a lot less of that cult of personality, a lot less of that instability. People having institutional memory, being able to check into the company a lot more because at every single stage of the process, there's more institutionalization as opposed to the reliance on two people, even prior to the initial public offering. And lastly, I just want to emphasize, if you think CEO switching causes volatility, that is no longer a shocker when it's suddenly a social norm. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
We thank the Government Whip and conclude this debate and the round up the round robin. We give the floor to the Office of the Whip.
Everyone ready? Closing government's big harm is market volatility. Even if we accept that this market volatility harms people other than the investors who accept that risk and buy the IPO very soon, not buy it way later on the secondary market, the average regular person who is exposed to the stock market is exposed to it via their pension fund or an index fund. And the thing about these funds is that they own almost the entire market, so they pool risk. It doesn't matter if individual stocks become slightly more volatile in Gov's world, because these investors are exposed to the entire market, and that volatility will, of course, correlated, is hedged against by the fact that the average person who's exposed to the stock is owning stocks to save for their retirement in like 20 years, so they probably don't care much about volatility. Volatility actually leads to higher returns often in the long run, so presumably they're okay with this. But their second harm was that companies, it is better when they delay their IPOs because they'll figure out their ideas better. I think that there are two reasons to not believe this. The first is that I just don't know if the actual fundamental premise that guides their extension, which is that it is easier to figure out things pre-IPO, is true at all. I think that there are very obvious empirical examples that the average reasonable voter does know of companies that use the IPO as the vehicle to test out new ideas and to make those pivots. That is why Amazon did its IPO before it pivoted into being a cloud service. That is why Apple did its IPO before pivoting into personal computing. Because frequently this is a way that you can change the image of the company in the eyes of your investors and also raise slightly more money than you otherwise could on private markets to do that pivot. But last of all, an IPO enables you to have a board with multiple members who are not existing parts of the group-thinking companies that Gov themselves on Closing Gov argue is a problem, meaning that more people are likely to suggest new ideas or more likely to suggest bringing in those outside consultants that OO says will get hired, and as a result, those new ideas are more likely to get tested and foregrounded. The second thing that I then want to address is why our extension is not logically contingent on opening opposition. So here's what opening opposition says. They say founders are good, and insofar as we want to win the round, we are reliant on founders being as good as they say. The problem with this is that our case just says, look, even if we accepted that founders were like actively worse at running companies in some marginal way compared to OG, like let's say OG just slightly wins on that clash. Maybe they do. It doesn't matter. Because what matters critically on our side are the constraints that are placed on those founders that cause them to be better, even if their intrinsic incentives were bad. The critical point from our side was that IPOs themselves solve for the problems that Gov talks about. The problems of accountability, for example, and cults of groupthink are solved for by the fact that you now have a board with a diverse number of people. You have representatives of BlackRock who own those index funds that are supposed to vote proxy for the people who own those things. You have representatives of activist investors who push you to do ESG things, like, for example, buying carbon write-offs for your stuff. So you have many more ideas that are being foregrounded. And of course, founders still retain control. They chair the meetings, their voices are heard a lot, but that groupthink is removed. And that's what makes the CG extension so nonsensical. Their extension 1 is that we get a delay. Their extension 2 is additional reasons on top of opening gov why groupthink is a problem. But insofar as there is a delay in their IPOs, that is a longer period in which the company is private, and therefore much more likely to be doing that groupthink for a longer period of time before the IPO. So it's not clear why extension 2 is not an additional reason why we shouldn't want companies to be private. But second of all, I think that the distributional effects of earlier IPOs are massive. For one, it just means that those impacts happen sooner, and critically, that the public gets to buy the IPO when it is lower value, meaning that they make a higher percentage-wise return if you're like a regular investor. But I think the second reason is that some companies will not IPO at all in Gov's world. And that's what they don't refute at all out of GovWIC, that very basic idea. Look, you can be a big company now and never IPO. The status of the IPO itself has become much less prestigious. There have been the rise of SPACs. Private markets have become vastly, vastly more liquid, meaning that it's far easier to buy and sell those stocks, and there's less risk associated with remaining private. And there's been the growth of many more venture capitalists and stuff who are willing to give you money, even if you don't have the same balance sheet availability, et cetera, that public companies would. The implication of that, and I'll get to that in a second, P1.
Sure. IPOs are also reduced when investors get cold feet after seeing IPOs fail from other previous examples. Isn't it better to increase the success rate of IPOs?
No, it doesn't reduce the IPOs. The IPOs are a market mechanism. What it does is it reduces the amount that people buy in on day one of the IPO. Like 2 years ago, if you did an IPO, you sold, immediately you made like 200% because IPOs were so frothy. The worst outcome in their world is that companies IPO a bit early and they get punished for it, right? They sell the stock and then they just like lose money. And that disincentivizes future IPOs from IPOing too early because they look at that company next door and they're like, oh, they IPO'd too early. If I want to double my money on day one from frothy market, I should wait. And that is why their extension solves itself, by the way. It's that if it is true that companies actually IPO too early, they look at the company that is most comparable to them, they're like, oh, screw it, I should like wait to IPO because investors think that my early IPOs are a bad idea. I think that removes closing government. The next thing that I then want to talk about is why it matters on a corporate governance level for our side to win. And this is where I'll bring in opening gov. I think opening gov does a very good job in terms of establishing why founders sometimes have bad incentives and why their cults of personality can direct companies too much. But I think that there have been narrative changes in the tech and business world that have reduced the influence of these people. So when you see prominent examples, even if they're exceptions to the case, of like Bezos putting Andy Jassy in instead, when you see examples like FTX imploding or like Theranos, that also creates a bit of a counter-narrative in the business world that says maybe we should be a little bit less trustful of these founders in the first place. So there are countervailing norms insofar as things go wrong and then markets react. They are not like I'm going to keep taking risks if these people consistently are bad. So there are market-based incentive mechanisms to a lot of their stuff. On their claim that founders like to keep their friends in charge, I'm just not sure, and they certainly assert way too much why this is true, but this is always a bad thing. Like, Steve Wozniak being kept at Apple is the reason why they pivoted and invented all that new tech. Often their friends are very qualified and understand the business nuances that they thought too, so I'm not sure this is a problem. OG.
Of course, there's always competing norms. This is a debate about which norm should be dominant. And so far as ours has the best incentives, we obviously win.
Yeah, but it's different norms. The norm that we're talking about in the round is a norm about whether founders should remain in control. The norm that I'm talking about is a norm about whether or not markets should unlimited trust those founders, which is an independent norm from what's going on. It's just about what people in the investment world think is, clearly independent. So, weighing over opening off. I do think that opening off does a reasonably okay job of establishing why it is that there's better governance sometimes. But the fair pushback is, OG says if they're on the board, they can still do some guidance and leadership, which ultimately then makes that a contingent question. Do you think they're actually going to use their position on the board to influence the CEO? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But if the board is public, and if there's an IPO, then we certainly know that that founder on the board is now being constrained by other representatives on the board who also have their ideas being platformed. So the takeaway is then as follows. if we accept that governance is okay, or at least a small margin on either side, then what you care about is the average investor, not even investors, like a literal person who has a retirement account, getting exposed to the wealth of companies far sooner and in a far better way. This is quite tangible in terms of just the literal money people have. But two, you also care about whether or not those companies are constrained. Every harm of Gov is amplified in terms of the founders running cults of personality and little dictatorships when those companies stay private. We proved those companies would. Closing Gov literally did not refute that at all. We are very proud to oppose.